The human mind has an unsettling tendency to remember certain horrors, while allowing others to fade into the darkness. We know the names that haunt our collective nightmares. Ted Bundy, with his charming facade, masking deadly intentions. Jeffrey Dahmer, whose apartment of horrors shocked the world. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who buried his victims beneath his home. These names have become synonymous with evil itself, their stories told and retold until they've become part of our cultural DNA. But what happens to the monsters we forget? What becomes of the killers whose crimes were so heinous, so numerous, that they dwarf even these infamous cases? Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on a different kind of darkness. We're going to explore the stories of serial killers whose names should echo through history, yet somehow slip through the cracks of our collective memory. These are not tales of fiction or urban legend. These are the true stories of real monsters who stalked real victims in real places, leaving behind trails of devastation that, for various reasons, the world chose to overlook or forget. Some operated in the shadows of political upheaval. Others exploited the trust placed in their professional positions. Many targeted society's most vulnerable, knowing their victims' voices would go unheard. The question that haunts us tonight is simple yet profound. How do we forget monsters responsible for hundreds, sometimes thousands of deaths? The answer lies in a complex web of social, political, and cultural factors that will unravel as we journey through these dark chapters of human history. Our first stop takes us to the mountainous regions of South America in the late 1970s, where a man known as the Monster of the Andes was terrorizing 3 entire countries. Pedro, born into poverty in Colombia in 1948, would grow up to become what many criminologists consider the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. The Colombia of youth was a nation in turmoil. The country was gripped by La Violencia, a period of brutal civil conflict that claimed over 200,000 lives between 1948 and 1958. In this atmosphere of normalized violence and political chaos, a different kind of predator was taking shape. Himself would later claim that his murderous impulses began early, sparked by childhood trauma and abuse that went unreported, unaddressed in a society too consumed by larger conflicts to notice the suffering of one orphaned boy. But story begins long before his first known murder. Born the 7th of 13 children to a prostitute in Tolima, Colombia, was cast out of his home at the age of 8 after being caught touching his sister, cast onto the streets of he. Survived by begging, stealing, and eventually by selling his body to survive. It was during this period, according to his own testimony, that he was repeatedly victimized by predators who saw in him what he would later see in his own victims: vulnerability and invisibility. By the time reached adolescence, something fundamental had broken inside him. The boy who had been failed by every system meant to protect him was transforming into something far more dangerous. He began stealing cars, which led to his first imprisonment at the age of 18. But prison, rather than reforming him, only deepened his pathology. He would later claim that he killed 3 fellow inmates who attempted to rape him, though these deaths were never officially investigated or confirmed. Released from prison in the early 1970s, began what he would call his missionary work. He had developed a twisted ideology that positioned him as an avenger of sorts, targeting young girls who reminded him of the innocence he felt had been stolen from him. But this was no noble mission. This was the beginning of a killing spree that would span over a decade and claim hundreds of lives across 3 countries. Methodology was as calculated as it was horrifying. He would spend weeks in a new area, carefully studying his hunting grounds and identifying potential victims. He targeted indigenous communities and impoverished areas where missing children were less likely to be reported or investigated thoroughly. His victims were almost exclusively young girls, between the ages of 9 and 12, chosen for what he described as their innocence and beauty. The scope of his crimes is staggering to contemplate. Himself confessed to murdering over 300 children, though investigators believe the true number may be significantly higher. To put this in perspective, this would make him responsible for more deaths than any other confirmed serial killer in history. Yet his name remains largely unknown outside of South America, overshadowed by killers with far fewer victims but greater media attention. How did he manage to operate for so long without detection? The answer lies in the social and political climate of 1970s South America. Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador were all dealing with internal conflicts, poverty, and weak governmental institutions. Indigenous communities, from which many of victims came, were marginalized and distrustful of authorities. When children went missing, families often lacked the resources or political capital to demand thorough investigations. Moreover, was intelligent and adaptable. He would never stay in one area too long, moving between countries and regions with an almost nomadic pattern that made it nearly impossible for local law enforcement to establish patterns or build comprehensive cases. He spoke multiple languages and could blend into different communities with disturbing ease. The breakthrough in the case came not through brilliant detective work or technological advancement, but through a chance encounter that revealed the monster hiding in plain sight. In 1980, in the town of Ambato, Ecuador, was caught in the act of attempting to abduct a young girl. A group of indigenous Ayachucos captured him and were preparing to execute him, when a local missionary intervened, convincing them to turn over to the authorities. Initially, was charged only with the attempted abduction, but during questioning, something extraordinary happened. Perhaps driven by ego, perhaps by a psychological need to be recognized for his accomplishments, began to confess, not just to the one attempted abduction, but to murders spanning over a decade in 3 countries. His confessions were so detailed and numerous that investigators initially dismissed them as the fantasies of a disturbed mind. How could one man be responsible for so many deaths? The number seemed impossible, almost absurd, but has led authorities to grave sites, providing specific details about victims and locations. The horrifying truth began to emerge. The investigation that followed revealed a trail of death stretching back years. Had been methodical in his record keeping, able to recall specific details about individual victims with chilling clarity. He described their appearances, the circumstances of their deaths, and the locations where he had buried their bodies. Teams of investigators and forensic experts began the grim task of excavating sites had identified, confirming murder after murder. What emerged from these excavations was not just evidence of crimes, but a damning indictment of the systems that had failed his victims. Many of the children he had killed had indeed been reported missing, but their disappearances had been inadequately investigated or dismissed entirely. The marginalized communities from which they came had been crying out for help that never arrived. The legal proceedings against were as complex as they were controversial, because his crime spanned multiple countries with different legal systems. Determining jurisdiction and appropriate charges became a diplomatic as well as legal challenge. Ecuador, where he was captured and had confessed to the most murders, took the lead in prosecuting him. Itenjo Baibashisen was convicted of murdering 110 young girls in Ecuador alone. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. This sentence sparked outrage among victim advocacy groups and international observers, who felt it was grossly inadequate given the scope of his crimes. But the legal saga was far from over. Colombia and Peru also wanted to prosecute for murders committed in their territories. However, the complexities of international law and the political instabilities in the region made coordinated prosecution nearly impossible. It effectively exploited not just vulnerable individuals, but the gaps between national justice systems. During his imprisonment, became a subject of intense study by criminologists and psychologists, attempting to understand how one individual could commit such extensive atrocities. He was articulate and willing to discuss his crimes in detail, providing researchers with unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. However, these interviews also revealed the extent to which remained unrepentant and dangerous. Showed no remorse for his victims, instead expressing pride in what he considered his efficiency and success in avoiding detection for so long. He described his murders in clinical terms, as if discussing a professional accomplishment rather than the deaths of hundreds of children. This psychological profile would later become crucial in understanding how such extensive killing sprees can occur and continue undetected. Inicio Su was released from prison in Ecuador after serving his full sentence. International law enforcement agencies immediately raised alarms about his release, but it served his time according to Ecuadorian law, and there was no legal mechanism to continue holding him. He was deported to Colombia, where he was immediately rearrested on charges related to murders committed there in the 1970s. However, in 1998, was again released, this time from Colombian custody, after a court declared that he had been held too long without trial. The families of his victims and international law enforcement were horrified. but there was little they could do under the existing legal frameworks. Current whereabouts remain unknown. There have been unconfirmed sightings and rumors placing him in various South American countries, but no verified information about his location or activities since 1998. The possibility that he might still be alive and potentially active remains a source of concern for law enforcement agencies across the region. The case of Pedro represents more than just the story of one prolific killer. It illuminates the ways in which social inequality, political instability, and institutional failures can create environments where the most vulnerable members of society become prey for predators. Victims were largely invisible to the broader world. Children from marginalized communities whose disappearances went unnoticed the international community's failure to develop adequate mechanisms for prosecuting crimes that cross national borders also played a role in S' ability to evade justice. While he was eventually convicted and imprisoned, the sentences he received were widely viewed as inadequate given the scope of his crimes. The fact that he was able to gain release and disappear entirely suggests that the systems designed to protect society from such predators remain fundamentally flawed. Perhaps most troubling is how easily his story has been forgotten by the wider world, despite being responsible for more confirmed murders than any other serial killer in history. His name is rarely mentioned in discussions of criminal history or popular culture treatments of serial killing. This erasure serves no one, except potentially himself, who may still be alive and whose story could serve as a warning and a call for better protection of vulnerable populations. As we prepare to explore more forgotten monsters, S' story sets the stage for understanding how killers can slip through the cracks of justice and memory. His case demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are often not the ones who capture headlines, but those who exploit society's blind spots and prey on those whose voices are least likely to be heard. The mountains of South America hold many secrets, but few as dark as the trail of death left by the monster of the Andes. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll see how different social conditions and institutional failures created opportunities for other forgotten killers to thrive, each leaving their own unique mark on the communities they terrorized and the systems that failed to stop them. From the mountains of South America, our journey takes us across the Atlantic to the fog-shrouded streets of Hyde, England, where in the 1990s, a different kind of monster was operating under the most trusted of guises. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman appeared to be everything a community could want in a family physician. Dedicated, hard-working, and deeply involved in the lives of his patients. Behind this facade, however, lay one of the most shocking betrayals of medical ethics in recorded history. The story of Harold Shipman forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about trust and authority in modern society. In few professions is trust more absolute than in medicine, where we literally place our lives in the hands of those we believe are trained to heal us. Shipman exploited this trust in the most calculated and devastating way possible, turning his medical practice into what investigators would later describe as a one-man killing field. Born in 1946 in Nottingham, Shipman grew up in a working-class family where education and professional achievement were highly valued. His mother, Vera, was particularly ambitious for her son and instilled in him a deep respect for authority and professional status. Ironically, these same qualities that initially drove Shipman toward a career in medicine may have later enabled him to exploit the trust that comes with that profession. Shipman's early life was marked by a formative trauma that many psychologists believe may have contributed to his later pathology. When he was 17, he watched his mother die slowly and painfully from lung cancer. During her final weeks, he observed how morphine injections provided her with relief from pain, but also how those same injections seemed to hasten her death. This experience may have planted the seeds of his later fascination with controlling life and death through medical intervention. After completing his medical training at Leeds University, Shipman began his career as a general practitioner in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. In 1974, even in these early years, there were warning signs that something was amiss. In 1975, just 1 year into his practice, colleagues became suspicious about his frequent requests for pethidine, a powerful painkiller. An investigation revealed that Shipman had been forging prescriptions to feed his own drug addiction. This incident should have ended Shipman's medical career, but the response from the medical establishment was remarkably lenient. He was fined a modest amount, attended a drug rehabilitation program, and was allowed to continue practicing medicine after a brief suspension. This early warning sign was effectively ignored, setting a pattern that would repeat throughout Shipman's career. Suspicious behavior that was noted but not adequately investigated. In 1977, Shipman moved to Hyde, a working-class town in Greater Manchester, where he would establish the practice that would become the epicenter of his killing spree. Hyde was exactly the kind of community where a dedicated family doctor could build a reputation and establish the deep trust that Shipman would later exploit. The town had an aging population, many of whom had known no other doctor than Shipman for decades. Shipman quickly became a pillar of the Hyde community. He was known for his willingness to make house calls, often arriving within minutes of being summoned by worried family members. He was particularly popular among elderly patients, who appreciated his old-fashioned bedside manner and apparent dedication to their care. What these patients and their families didn't know was that Shipman was systematically identifying and targeting the most vulnerable among them. The doctor's methodology was as sophisticated as it was evil. Shipman carefully selected victims who lived alone or had minimal family contact, reducing the likelihood that his presence during their deaths would be questioned. He typically targeted elderly women, though his victims ranged in age from their 40s to their 90s. His preferred method was lethal injection of diamorphine, a powerful opiate that would cause respiratory failure within minutes. What made Shipman's crimes particularly insidious was how he used his medical authority to control the narrative around each death. As a doctor, he had the legal authority to certify deaths and determine causes without external oversight. He would arrive at a victim's home, administer the lethal injection, then position the body to suggest natural death. When family members arrived, they would find Shipman already there, ready to console them and explain how their loved one had passed peacefully. The scope of Shipman's killing spree is staggering to contemplate. Official investigations would later determine that he was responsible for at least 218 deaths, though the true number may be significantly higher. Some estimates suggest he may have killed over 250 people during his career, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Yet unlike other serial killers who operate in the shadows, Shipman committed his murders in broad daylight, protected by the trust society places in medical professionals. For over 2 decades, Shipman's crimes went undetected. There were occasional questions raised by funeral directors who noticed an unusually high number of deaths among Shipman's patients, but these concerns were rarely pursued by authorities. The medical establishment's reluctance to investigate one of their own, combined with the natural tendency to trust doctors, created an environment where Shipman could operate with virtual impunity. The breakthrough in the Shipman case came not from law enforcement or medical oversight, but from the suspicious death of one particular victim that finally raised questions too significant to ignore. Kathleen Grundy was a wealthy, 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde, who was found dead in her home on June 24, 1998. Shipman certified her death as natural, but her daughter Angela Woodruff, who was a lawyer, became suspicious when she learned that her mother had allegedly left her entire estate to Shipman in a will that appeared to have been forged. Woodruff's legal training led her to question not just the suspicious will, but the circumstances of her mother's death. She contacted the police and demanded an investigation, setting in motion the events that would finally expose Shipman's decades-long killing spree. When Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed and examined, toxicologists found lethal levels of morphine in her system, levels that could only have resulted from deliberate injection. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex and disturbing in British criminal history, led by Detective Chief Inspector Mike Williams. The inquiry team began the painstaking process of examining hundreds of deaths that had occurred under Shipman's care. They interviewed family members, reviewed medical records, and in many cases, ordered exhumations to test for evidence of poisoning. What emerged from this investigation was a pattern of death that defied all medical and statistical norms. Shipman's patients were dying at rates significantly higher than those of other doctors in the area. More disturbing still, many of these deaths occurred when patients were alone with Shipman, often during unscheduled house calls that the doctor had initiated himself. The investigation revealed Shipman's methodology in chilling detail. He would typically call patients, or their families, claiming to be checking on their condition or following up on recent treatments. Once alone with his intended victim, he would inject them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, then wait for them to die before discovering the body and calling emergency services. His medical authority allowed him to certify these deaths as natural without external examination, effectively covering his tracks. As the investigation progressed, a horrifying picture emerged of systematic murder spanning decades. Shipman had kept detailed records of his drug acquisitions, allowing investigators to track his accumulation of the diamorphine used in the murders. They found that he had been stockpiling the drug by claiming it was needed for terminally ill patients who were actually already dead, then using the excess supplies to kill healthy victims. The trial of Harold Shipman began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. Given the enormous scope of his alleged crimes, prosecutors decided to charge him with 15 specific murders, plus 1 count of forgery related to Kathleen Grundy's will. The selection of these particular cases was strategic, chosen because they offered the strongest forensic evidence and the clearest proof of Shipman's guilt. During the trial, prosecutors painted a devastating picture of a doctor who had betrayed the most fundamental principles of his profession. They demonstrated how Shipman had systematically exploited the trust of his patients and their families, using his medical knowledge and authority to commit murder with impunity. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic proof of poisoning, statistical analysis showing impossible death rates, and testimony from family members who described Shipman as suspicious behavior around the time of their loved ones' deaths. Shipman himself proved to be an unconvincing defendant. His arrogance and apparent lack of remorse alienated the jury, while his attempts to explain away the evidence only served to highlight the implausibility of his claims. When asked directly whether he had killed his patients, Shipman's denials seemed hollow and rehearsed, lacking any emotional conviction. On January 31, 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted on all 15 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, described Shipman's crimes as exceptionally grave and noted that the doctor had betrayed the trust of his patients and their families in the most fundamental way possible. But the conviction was only the beginning of the broader reckoning with Shipman's crimes. The British government immediately launched a comprehensive inquiry led by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith to determine the full extent of Shipman's killing spree and to identify the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The Shipman inquiry, which lasted 6 years and cost over £21 million, produced a series of reports that fundamentally changed how deaths are investigated and certified in Britain. The inquiry determined that Shipman was responsible for 218 deaths and may have killed an additional 45 patients, though the evidence in these cases was insufficient for definitive conclusions. The inquiry also identified numerous points where Shipman's activities should have been detected and stopped, revealing systematic failures in medical oversight, death certification, and drug monitoring. Dame Janet Smith's final report was a damning indictment not just of Shipman himself, but of the entire system that had enabled his crimes. She identified a culture of deference to medical authority that made it virtually impossible for concerns about a doctor's behavior to be raised or investigated effectively. The inquiry found that funeral directors, coroners, and even other medical professionals had noticed suspicious patterns in Shipman's practice, but had been reluctant to challenge a respected colleague, or had been rebuffed when they tried to raise concerns. The inquiry's recommendations led to significant reforms in British medical practice and death investigation procedures. New systems were implemented for monitoring doctors' drug prescriptions, death certification was moved away from single doctor authority, and new mechanisms were created for investigating suspicious patterns of death. These changes were designed to ensure that no doctor could again exploit the trust of patients and the deference of colleagues in the way Shipman had done. On January 13, 2004, before the full extent of his crimes had been officially determined, Harold Shipman was found dead in his prison cell at Wakefield Prison. He had hanged himself using bed sheets, leaving no note or explanation for his actions. His suicide meant that the full truth about his motivations and the complete scope of his crimes would never be known. Shipman's death sparked controversy and disappointment among the families of his victims, many of whom felt robbed of the opportunity to confront their loved one's killer and to understand why he had committed such heinous acts. His suicide also meant that any remaining secrets about potential additional victims died with him, leaving some families forever uncertain about the circumstances of their relatives' deaths. The psychological profile that emerged from the Shipman case presented a complex picture of a man driven by a need for control and power over life and death. Unlike many serial killers who are motivated by sexual gratification or sadistic pleasure, Shipman appeared to derive satisfaction from his ability to decide when and how people would die. Some psychologists have suggested that his crimes were an extension of a God complex common among medical professionals. Taken to its ultimate and most destructive extreme, the impact of Shipman's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims and their families. His actions fundamentally undermined public trust in the medical profession, particularly among elderly patients who had once viewed their family doctors as figures of absolute authority and trustworthiness. The case forced a national conversation about medical accountability and the dangers of unchecked professional authority. Our journey through the annals of forgotten monsters now takes us to post-World War II Japan, a nation struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes of devastating defeat. In this landscape of desperation and moral collapse, a woman named Miyuki Ishikawa found opportunity in others' despair, becoming what history would remember as the demon midwife. Her story reveals how societal breakdown and economic desperation can create conditions where the most vulnerable become prey to those they trust most. The Japan of the late 1940s was a country transformed beyond recognition. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Allied occupation, and the complete restructuring of Japanese society had left millions struggling to survive in a world where traditional values and systems had been shattered. In these chars, normal moral boundaries became blurred, and opportunities arose for those willing to exploit others' desperation. Miyuki Ishikawa was born in 1897 into a Japan that was rapidly modernizing but still deeply traditional. She received training as a midwife during the 1920s, a profession that carried significant respect and responsibility in Japanese society. Midwives were not just medical professionals, but trusted community figures who guided families through one of life's most significant moments. This trust would later become the foundation for her crimes. The economic devastation of post-war Japan created conditions unlike anything the country had previously experienced. Millions of families found themselves unable to provide for existing children, let alone new babies. The traditional extended family networks that had previously supported child rearing had been disrupted by war, displacement, and economic collapse. In this environment, unwanted pregnancies became not just personal tragedies, but potentially life-threatening economic burdens. Ishikawa recognized the desperation of these families and developed what she presented as a solution to their problems. Working in the impoverished areas around Tokyo, she began offering services that went far beyond traditional midwifery. She would approach families struggling with unwanted pregnancies and offer to handle the situation for them, using language that was deliberately ambiguous but understood by both parties. What Ishikawa was actually offering was infanticide disguised as medical care. She would assist in deliveries but then kill the newborns through various methods, including strangulation, suffocation, and poisoning. She would then dispose of the bodies in mass graves that she had prepared in advance, often in remote areas outside Tokyo where the remains were unlikely to be discovered. The scope of Ishikawa's crimes is difficult to determine precisely due to the chaotic record-keeping of the immediate post-war period. Official investigations would later attribute over 100 infant deaths to her actions, but historians believe the true number may be significantly higher. Some estimates suggest she may have been responsible for the deaths of as many as 300 infants between 1945 and 1948. Ishikawa did not work alone in her deadly enterprise. She recruited a network of accomplices, including other medical professionals and community figures, who helped identify potential clients and dispose of evidence. This network allowed her to operate on a scale that would have been impossible for a single individual, turning what might have been isolated incidents of infanticide into a systematic operation. The social conditions that enabled Ishikawa's crimes were complex and deeply rooted in Japan's post-war trauma. The Allied occupation had introduced new ideas about women's rights and reproductive freedom, but these concepts existed alongside traditional Japanese values that still stigmatized unwed mothers and families, unable to provide for their children. This created a moral gray area where desperate families might rationalize actions they would never have considered under normal circumstances. Moreover, the breakdown of traditional authority structures meant that there was little oversight of medical professionals like Ishikawa. The Japanese medical system was in chaos, with many trained professionals killed or displaced during the war. This created opportunities for individuals like Ishikawa to operate with minimal supervision, exploiting the trust placed in medical professionals while avoiding the scrutiny that might have detected their crimes. The economic desperation of the period cannot be understated as a factor in Ishikawa's ability to find clients for her services. Food shortages were severe, housing was scarce, and employment opportunities were limited. For many families, the prospect of another mouth to feed represented not just financial hardship, but potential starvation for existing family members. In this context, Ishikawa's offer to solve the problem of unwanted children found a receptive audience among desperate parents. Ishikawa's methodology was as calculated as it was cruel. She would establish relationships with families during pregnancy, gaining their trust and understanding their financial circumstances. She would then gradually introduce the idea that the family might be better off without the additional burden of a new child. Her medical authority and the desperate circumstances of her clients made these conversations more persuasive than they might otherwise have been. The actual killings were carried out with clinical efficiency. Ishikawa would assist in normal deliveries, but then, while families were still recovering from childbirth, she would kill the infants using methods that left minimal evidence. She had developed techniques that could be disguised as natural infant mortality, which was unfortunately common in post-war Japan due to malnutrition and poor medical conditions. The disposal of bodies was equally systematic. Ishikawa had identified several remote locations around Tokyo where she could bury the victims without detection. These mass graves would later become key evidence in her prosecution, providing physical proof of the scope of her crimes. The methodical nature of these burial sites suggested a level of premeditation and organization that went far beyond impulsive acts of desperation. For several years, Ishikawa's operation continued undetected. The chaos of post-war Japan meant that record-keeping was inconsistent, and the deaths of infants, while tragic, were not uncommon enough to raise immediate suspicions. Moreover, the families involved had every reason to keep silent about what had happened, as admitting their involvement would have brought shame and potentially legal consequences. The beginning of the end for Ishikawa came not from law enforcement investigation, but from a former client who was haunted by what had happened. In 1948, a woman who had used Ishikawa's services contacted authorities and provided details about what she had witnessed. This woman, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, described watching Ishikawa kill her newborn child and dispose of the body. The investigation that followed was one of the most shocking in Japanese criminal history. Police began interviewing other families who had used Ishikawa's services, gradually building a picture of systematic infanticide that had been occurring for years. Many families initially denied any wrongdoing, but as evidence mounted, some began to cooperate with investigators, providing details about Ishikawa's methods and the locations where she had disposed of bodies. The excavation of Ishikawa's burial sites provided the physical evidence needed to support the testimonial accounts from families and accomplices. Forensic investigators uncovered the remains of dozens of infants, many showing signs of deliberate killing rather than natural death. These discoveries confirmed the worst fears of investigators and demonstrated the industrial scale of Ishikawa's crimes. The trial of Miyuki Ishikawa and her accomplices began in 1949, attracting significant attention from both Japanese and international media. The case forced Japan to confront the moral complexities of its post-war situation and to grapple with questions about desperation, survival, and the limits of acceptable behavior, even in extreme circumstances. During the trial, prosecutors painted Ishikawa as a cold-blooded killer who had exploited the desperation of vulnerable families for her own financial gain. They demonstrated that she had charged families for her services, making money from both the births and the subsequent killings. This financial motive distinguished her crimes from acts of desperation by individual families and established clear criminal intent. The defense attempted to portray Ishikawa as a product of her circumstances, arguing that the extreme conditions of post-war Japan had created situations where normal moral judgments could not apply. They suggested that she had genuinely believed she was helping families avoid even greater tragedies, and that her actions, while illegal, were understandable given the context. However, the systematic nature of Ishikawa's crimes and the evidence of premeditation made these arguments difficult to sustain. The prosecution was able to demonstrate that she had planned and organized her operation over several years, recruiting accomplices and developing methodical procedures for both killing and disposal. This level of organization suggested criminal enterprise rather than desperate response to circumstances. In 1950, Miyuki Ishikawa was convicted of multiple counts of infanticide and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Her accomplices received lesser sentences, reflecting their secondary roles in the enterprise. The sentences were viewed by many as surprisingly lenient, given the scope of the crimes. But the court cited the extraordinary circumstances of post-war Japan as mitigating factors. The Ishikawa case had far-reaching implications for Japanese society and medical practice. It highlighted the vulnerabilities created by social and economic chaos, and demonstrated how traditional trust relationships could be exploited by predatory individuals. The case also contributed to discussions about reproductive rights and social support systems that would influence Japanese policy for decades to come. The revelation of Ishikawa's crimes also sparked soul-searching within the Japanese medical community about professional oversight and ethical standards. The fact that a trained medical professional had systematically killed the people she was supposed to protect raised questions about training, supervision, and accountability that led to significant reforms in medical education and practice. Ishikawa served her full sentence and was released from prison in 1958. Unlike some of the other cases we've examined, she largely disappeared from public view after her release, living quietly until her death in the 1970s. Her case, while shocking at the time, gradually faded from public memory as Japan rebuilt itself and moved beyond the desperate circumstances of the immediate post-war period. The legacy of Miyuki Ishikawa's crimes extends beyond the immediate horror of her actions to broader questions about how societies respond to extreme circumstances. Her case demonstrates how social breakdown can create opportunities for exploitation, and how traditional authority figures can betray the trust placed in them when normal moral constraints are weakened. The fact that Ishikawa's story has been largely forgotten outside of Japan reflects not just the passage of time, but also the uncomfortable questions it raises about complicity and desperation. Unlike serial killers who prey on random victims, Ishikawa's crimes involved willing participation from families who saw her services as solutions to impossible circumstances. This complexity makes her story more disturbing, but also more difficult to process and remember. As we continue our exploration of forgotten monsters, Ishikawa's case serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from desperation as well as pathology. Her crimes were enabled not just by her own moral failures, but by social conditions that created markets for her deadly services. Understanding these conditions is crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future, and for recognizing the warning signs when societies face extreme stress from the desperate streets of post-war Japan. Our investigation now moves to the vast wilderness of Alaska, where during the 1970s and early 1980s a different kind of predator was stalking his prey across one of America's most unforgiving landscapes. Robert Hansen's story forces us to confront how someone can live a completely double life, maintaining a facade of normalcy while secretly indulging in the most savage impulses. Alaska in the 1970s was still very much a frontier territory. Despite having achieved statehood in 1959, Anchorage, while growing rapidly due to the oil boom, remained a rough-and-tumble city where people could reinvent themselves, and where questions about someone's past were rarely asked. This environment provided perfect cover for Robert Hansen, a man who appeared to be living the American dream while secretly orchestrating nightmares in the wilderness. Robert Christian Hansen was born in 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, into what appeared to be a stable, middle-class family. His father owned a bakery, a respectable family business that provided a comfortable living and standing in the community. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, young Robert was struggling with demons that would eventually consume him and destroy dozens of lives. Hansen's childhood was marked by severe acne, a stutter, and social awkwardness that made him a target for bullying and rejection by his peers. These early experiences of humiliation and powerlessness would later manifest in his need to dominate and control his victims. The boy who was mocked and rejected by his classmates was developing a rage that would eventually find its outlet in the most horrific ways imaginable. Despite his social difficulties, Hansen showed an early aptitude for hunting and marksmanship. The Iowa wilderness became his refuge, a place where he felt powerful and in control. Hunting provided him with a sense of mastery over life and death that he could unfind in his social interactions. This passion for hunting would later become the foundation for his most disturbing crimes, as he developed a twisted fantasy of hunting human prey. After high school, Hansen briefly joined the Army Reserve and then worked in his father's bakery, learning the trade that would later provide him with his respectable civilian identity. But the small-town environment of Iowa felt increasingly constraining to Hansen, who harbored dreams of adventure and reinvention. In 1967, he made the decision that would ultimately enable his crimes. He moved to Alaska. The Alaska that greeted Hansen was a land of extraordinary opportunity and minimal oversight. The state was experiencing rapid growth due to the discovery of oil, creating a boomtown atmosphere where newcomers could quickly establish themselves and build new identities. For someone seeking to escape the limitations and judgments of their past, Alaska represented a fresh start in the truest sense. Hansen quickly established himself in Anchorage's business community, opening a bakery that became popular with locals and quickly earned him a reputation as a hardworking, reliable businessman. He married a local woman, Dala, and they had 2 children together, creating the picture of a successful family man who had realized the American dream in America's last frontier. But Hansen was living a carefully constructed lie. Behind his public persona as a devoted family man and successful businessman, he was developing and refining fantasies that would eventually drive him to become one of Alaska's most notorious serial killers. The vast wilderness that surrounded Anchorage, which had initially attracted him with its promise of hunting and adventure, was becoming the stage for increasingly dark obsessions. Hansen's transformation from fantasy to action appears to have been gradual, beginning with minor crimes that escalated over time. In the early 1970s, he was arrested several times for theft and arson, crimes that seemed disconnected from his later pattern, but may have represented early expressions of his antisocial impulses. These arrests were relatively minor and didn't seriously damage his public reputation, but they provided early warning signs that something was seriously wrong beneath his respectable facade. The true beginning of Hansen's killing career is difficult to pinpoint precisely, as many of his early victims were women whose disappearances weren't immediately connected or thoroughly investigated. Alaska's transient population, combined with the dangerous environment and limited law enforcement resources, created conditions where people could disappear without generating the kind of intensive investigation that might have detected patterns earlier. Hansen's methodology was as calculated as it was disturbing. He would target women involved in prostitution or exotic dancing, often approaching them under the pretext of paying for sexual services. He would then kidnap them, usually at gunpoint, and transport them to remote locations in the Alaskan wilderness. What happened next reveals the depths of Hansen's twisted psychology and the extent to which he had transformed his childhood passion for hunting into something monstrous. Hansen would release his victims into the wilderness and then hunt them like animals, using his extensive knowledge of the Alaskan terrain and his superior equipment to track them down. He had turned murder into a sport, treating human beings as prey in a deadly game where only he knew the rules. This methodology reveals not just sadistic cruelty, but a level of premeditation and planning that demonstrates the organized nature of his criminal enterprise. The psychological profile that emerges from Hansen's crimes is particularly disturbing because of how it combined his legitimate skills and interests with his criminal impulses. His expertise as a hunter, his knowledge of Alaska's wilderness, and his access to aircraft and weapons all became tools in his killing spree. He had essentially weaponized his hobbies and professional skills in service of his homicidal fantasies. Hansen's access to aircraft was particularly significant in enabling his crimes. He was a licensed pilot who owned a small plane, which he used to transport victims to remote locations throughout Alaska. This mobility allowed him to select killing sites that were virtually inaccessible to ground-based law enforcement, making recovery of evidence and victims extremely difficult. The vastness of Alaska worked in Hansen's favor, providing him with an almost unlimited number of potential dumping grounds for his victims' remains. For over a decade, Hansen continued his deadly pattern while maintaining his respectable public persona. He was active in community organizations, successful in business, and appeared to be a devoted family man. This duality is one of the most chilling aspects of his case, demonstrating how effectively some predators can compartmentalize their lives and maintain facades that completely contradict their true nature. The investigation that would eventually expose Hansen began not with law enforcement detecting his pattern, but with the survival of one of his intended victims. In June 1983, a young woman named Cindy Paulson managed to escape from Hansen. After he had kidnapped her and was preparing to transport her to a remote location, her detailed account to police provided the first clear picture of Hansen's methodology and gave investigators their first solid lead. Paulson's testimony was initially met with skepticism by some law enforcement officials, who found it difficult to believe that a respected businessman could be responsible for such elaborate and horrific crimes. However, Detective Glenn Floth of the Anchorage Police Department recognized the significance of her account and began an investigation that would eventually uncover the full scope of Hansen's activities. The investigation was complicated by the remote locations of Hansen's crimes and the difficulty of recovering physical evidence from Alaska's wilderness. However, investigators were able to connect Hansen to several disappearances through various pieces of circumstantial evidence, including witness testimony, placing him with victims shortly before they disappeared and evidence linking him to locations where remains were eventually found. A crucial breakthrough came when investigators were able to obtain a search warrant for Hansen's home and property. The search revealed a cache of weapons, maps marking remote locations throughout Alaska, and most damaging of all, personal items belonging to several missing women. This physical evidence provided the foundation for building a comprehensive case against Hansen. The maps found in Hansen's possession were particularly revealing, showing marked locations throughout Alaska that corresponded to sites where victims' remains were later discovered. These maps demonstrated not only Hansen's guilt, but also the systematic nature of his crimes. He had been keeping records of his kills, treating them like hunting trophies to be cataloged and remembered. As the investigation progressed, the true scope of Hansen's crimes became clear. He was eventually linked to the murders of at least 17 women, though investigators believe the actual number may be higher. Many of his victims were never identified, their remains discovered in remote wilderness locations where they might have remained hidden forever, if not for Hansen's own records. The trial of Robert Hansen began in 1984, presenting prosecutors with the challenge of proving a complex pattern of crimes that had occurred over more than a decade in some of Alaska, its most remote locations. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and the physical evidence recovered from Hansen's property. Hansen initially maintained his innocence, relying on his reputation in the community and the seemingly incredible nature of the charges against him. However, as evidence mounted and investigators continued to discover remains at locations marked on his maps, his position became increasingly untenable. Eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Hansen agreed to plea negotiations. In February 1984, Hansen pled guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. As part of his plea agreement, he provided detailed information about additional crimes and helped investigators locate the remains of additional victims. This cooperation, while helpful for bringing closure to families, also revealed the calculated nature of his crimes and his detailed memories of each killing. The Hansen case had profound impacts on law enforcement practices in Alaska and raised awareness about the vulnerabilities of certain populations to predatory behavior. The fact that Hansen had been able to operate for so long while maintaining his respectable facade highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies and more systematic approaches to investigating disappearances. The case also highlighted the particular challenges of investigating crimes in Alaska's vast wilderness, where traditional forensic techniques and search methods are often inadequate. Hansen's ability to use Alaska's geography to his advantage demonstrated how environmental factors can enable certain types of crimes while making investigation and prosecution more difficult. Hansen remained in prison until his death in 2014, never showing genuine remorse for his crimes and continuing to maintain that he had been justified in targeting women he viewed as less valuable members of society. His attitude revealed the fundamental dehumanization that had enabled his crimes and the persistence of the attitudes that had driven him to kill in the first place. The psychological analysis of Hansen's case provides insights into how childhood trauma and social rejection can combine with environmental opportunities to create extremely dangerous predators. Hansen's transformation of hunting skills into murder weapons demonstrates how legitimate interests and abilities can be perverted by criminal impulses. When proper moral and legal constraints are absent, the impact of Hansen's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect Alaska's entire community, particularly women working in vulnerable professions. The knowledge that a respected businessman could secretly be a predatory killer undermined trust and forced community members to confront uncomfortable realities about the potential for evil to hide behind respectable facades. Hansen's story also illustrates the importance of taking seriously reports from marginalized victims, as his crimes might have been stopped earlier if initial reports had been more thoroughly investigated. The skepticism that initially greeted Cindy Paulson's testimony reflects broader societal attitudes that can enable predators by making it difficult for their victims to be heard and believed. As we continue our exploration of forgotten monsters, Hansen's case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who have learned to blend into respectable society while secretly indulging their most savage impulses. His ability to maintain a double life for so long demonstrates the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and taking seriously any signs that someone may be leading a life very different from what they present to the world. Our journey into the darkness of forgotten monsters now takes us to Indonesia in the early 1980s, where traditional beliefs and modern brutality intersected in the most horrifying ways. Ahmad Suradji, known as the ritual killer, represents a particularly disturbing category of serial killer. Those who use religious or spiritual justifications to rationalize systematic murder. His story reveals how cultural beliefs can be twisted and exploited by those seeking to justify their most savage impulses. Indonesia in the early 1980s was a nation struggling to balance rapid modernization with traditional values and beliefs. Under President Suharto's New Order regime, the country was experiencing significant economic growth. But this modernization was occurring alongside the persistence of traditional spiritual practices and beliefs. This cultural tension created environments where individuals like Suradji could exploit traditional beliefs while operating within increasingly modern social structures. Ahmad Suradji was born in 1949 in North Sumatra into a family that practiced traditional Javanese mysticism alongside Islam. From an early age, he was exposed to beliefs about supernatural powers, spiritual energy, and the ability of certain individuals to manipulate these forces for various purposes. These traditional beliefs would later provide the framework for the twisted ideology that would drive his killing spree. As a young man, Suradji established himself as a traditional healer or a respected role in Indonesian society that involves using spiritual practices to cure illnesses, solve personal problems, and provide guidance to community members. Dukuns occupy a unique position in Indonesian culture, straddling the line between traditional spiritual leadership and practical. This role provided Suradji with both social standing and access to vulnerable individuals seeking help with their problems. The transformation of Suradji from traditional healer to serial killer appears to have been gradual, driven by an increasingly distorted interpretation of traditional spiritual practices. According to his later testimony, he began to believe that he could achieve supernatural powers and even immortality by performing ritual murders of virgin women. This belief system, while completely foreign to legitimate traditional practices, provided him with a framework for justifying his crimes to himself and potentially to others. Suradji's methodology combined traditional ritual elements with calculated predatory behavior. He would attract victims by advertising his services as a healer and spiritual advisor, appealing to women who are facing personal problems or seeking solutions to life challenges. Once he had gained their trust and isolated them, he would kill them in what he claimed were ritual ceremonies designed to harvest their spiritual energy. The specific nature of Suradji's ritual killings was particularly disturbing, involving elements that appeared to be derived from perverted interpretations of traditional practices. He would bury his victims up to their necks and then strangle them while performing what he claimed were spiritual ceremonies. After killing them, he would arrange their bodies in specific patterns that he believed would maximize the spiritual energy he could derive from their deaths. Between 1986 and 1997, Suradji is believed to have killed at least 42 women, though the actual number may be higher. His victims ranged in age from their teens to their 40s, but he specifically sought out women he believed to be virgins, as his twisted ideology required this for his supposed spiritual purposes. The systematic nature of his crimes and the specific requirements of his victim selection demonstrate the organized and premeditated nature of his killing spree. The social and cultural context that enabled Suradji's crimes was complex, involving both traditional tolerance for spiritual practices and modern Indonesia's rapid social changes. The respect traditionally accorded to spiritual healers provided Suradji with credibility and access to victims, while the social disruption caused by rapid modernization created populations of vulnerable individuals seeking guidance and help. Suradji's ability to operate for over a decade without detection was facilitated by several factors unique to his cultural environment. Traditional healing practices often involved secrecy and privacy, making it difficult for outsiders to monitor what was occurring during spiritual sessions. Moreover, the women who sought Suradji's help often came from marginalized or troubled backgrounds, making their disappearances less likely to be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The investigation that would eventually expose Suradji began in 1997 when local residents became suspicious about strange smells and activities around his property. When police investigated, they discovered a horrifying scene. Dozens of bodies buried in shallow graves around Suradji's home, arranged in patterns that reflected his twisted spiritual beliefs. The discovery shocked Indonesia and revealed the scope of what had been occurring under the guise of traditional healing. The forensic investigation that followed was one of the most complex in Indonesian history, involving the excavation and examination of dozens of bodies in various states of decomposition. The evidence revealed not only the scope of Suradji's crimes, but also the systematic nature of his methodology. Each killing had followed a similar pattern, suggesting that Suradji had developed a consistent ritual that he believed would achieve his spiritual goals. During his interrogation, Suradji was surprisingly forthcoming about his crimes, apparently believing that his spiritual justifications would be understood and accepted by authorities. He explained his belief system in detail, describing how he thought the ritual murders would grant him supernatural powers and ultimately immortality. His apparent conviction that his actions were spiritually justified revealed the depth of his delusion and the extent to which he had perverted traditional beliefs to serve his criminal impulses. The trial of Ahmad Suradji attracted significant attention throughout Indonesia and raised difficult questions about the relationship between traditional spiritual practices and modern legal systems. Prosecutors had to navigate the sensitive territory of condemning Suradji's crimes while not appearing to attack traditional beliefs or practices that remained important to many Indonesians. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities of women seeking help from traditional healers and the potential for spiritual authority to be exploited for criminal purposes. Suradji's victims had approached him seeking legitimate help with their problems, only to encounter a predator who saw them as raw material for his twisted spiritual ambitions. In 1998, Suradji was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The Indonesian court rejected his claims about spiritual justification, recognizing his actions as calculated murders rather than legitimate religious practices. His execution was carried out in 2008, bringing an end to one of Indonesia's most disturbing criminal cases. The impact of Suradji's crimes extended beyond their immediate horror to broader questions about how traditional practices can be perverted and exploited. His case demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between legitimate spiritual practices and criminal activity, disguised as religious or traditional behavior. From the humid jungles of Indonesia, our investigation now moves to the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, where during the 1970s and 1980s, a different kind of monster was stalking the streets of Rostov-on-Don. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, or the Red Ripper, would become one of the most prolific and savage serial killers in recorded history, operating within a political system that initially refused to acknowledge his existence. The Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s presented a unique environment for understanding how political ideology can interfere with criminal investigation and enable predators to operate with impunity. The Communist Party's insistence that serious crime was a capitalist phenomenon created institutional blindness that allowed Chikatilo to kill for over a decade before authorities were willing to acknowledge the reality of what was happening. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine, into a world that would be shaped by some of the most traumatic events in human history. His childhood was marked by the Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, which killed millions of people and created conditions of desperation and social breakdown that would have lasting effects on those who survived it. The psychological trauma of this period, combined with personal humiliations and failures, would contribute to the development of one of history's most dangerous killers. Chikatilo's early life was marked by a series of personal failures and humiliations that appear to have contributed to his later pathology. He struggled with nearsightedness that went uncorrected, making him appear clumsy and incompetent. In many situations, he also suffered from chronic bedwetting and would appear to have been early signs of sexual dysfunction, all of which made him a target for mockery and rejection by his peers. Despite these early struggles, Chikatilo managed to achieve a level of educational and professional success that provided him with respectability and access to potential victims. He became a teacher and later worked in various administrative positions, roles that brought him into contact with children and young people who would later become his preferred victims. The development of Chikatilo's homicidal impulses appears to have been gradual, beginning with sexual assaults and escalating to murder over a period of several years. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1978, but investigators believe he may have been committing sexual assaults and possibly murders for several years before this. The long development period of his criminal behavior demonstrates how dangerous individuals can remain undetected while their pathology develops and intensifies. Chikatilo's methodology was characterized by extreme brutality and sexual violence that shocked even experienced investigators. He would typically approach victims at train stations or other public locations, using his ordinary appearance and professional demeanor to gain their trust. He would then lure them to secluded areas where he would subject them to horrific sexual violence before killing them and mutilating their bodies. The extreme nature of Chikatilo's violence served multiple purposes in his twisted psychology. The mutilation and cannibalism that characterized many of his crimes appear to have been connected to his sexual dysfunction and his need to achieve satisfaction through increasingly extreme forms of violence. The psychological profile that emerged from his crimes revealed a deeply disturbed individual whose pathology had developed over many years into something truly monstrous. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo is confirmed to have killed at least 52 people, though some investigators believe the actual number may be higher. His victims included children, teenagers, and young adults of both sexes, though he showed a particular preference for young women and children. The geographic spread of his crimes, which occurred across multiple regions of the Soviet Union, demonstrated his mobility and the systematic nature of his hunting behavior. The investigation of Chikatilo's crimes was hampered from the beginning by the Soviet system's ideological constraints and institutional failings. The Communist Party's official position was that serial murder was a product of capitalist decadence and could not occur in a socialist society. This ideological blindness meant that authorities were initially reluctant to acknowledge that a serial killer was operating, instead attributing individual murders to separate cases or different causes. The breakthrough in the Chikatilo case came only after Soviet society began to open up under Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, which allowed for more honest acknowledgement of social problems. In 1988, a special investigative unit was formed under the leadership of Ishikawa, an experienced investigator who was given broad authority to pursue the case without the political constraints that had previously hampered the investigation. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in Soviet history, involving hundreds of investigators and the examination of thousands of potential suspects. The team used newly available psychological profiling techniques and forensic methods that had previously been dismissed as Western pseudoscience. This more scientific approach to investigation ultimately led to Chikatilo's identification and capture. The arrest of Chikatilo in 1990 came after investigators had established surveillance on him based on circumstantial evidence linking him to several crime scenes. When he was finally taken into custody, his confession revealed the full scope of his crimes and provided details about murders that had remained unsolved for years. His willingness to confess in detail may have been motivated by a desire for recognition and a need to demonstrate his intelligence and sophistication to his interrogators. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in 1992, in a Russia that was undergoing dramatic political and social transformation following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The proceedings attracted international attention and provided an opportunity for Russian society to confront the failures of the Soviet system that had enabled Chikatilo's crimes to continue for so long. During the trial, Chikatilo's behavior was erratic and disturbing, alternating between apparent remorse and bizarre outbursts that suggested ongoing mental instability. He provided detailed accounts of his crimes while simultaneously attempting to minimize his responsibility by claiming various forms of mental illness or external influence. His testimony revealed not only the scope of his crimes, but also the twisted thought processes that had driven him to commit them. The psychological evaluation of Chikatilo revealed a complex case of sexual pathology, sadistic personality disorder, and possible brain damage that may have contributed to his violent behavior. However, experts concluded that despite his mental disorders, he was competent to stand trial and understood the nature and consequences of his actions. In 1994, Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. His execution was carried out in 1994, bringing an end to one of the most horrific criminal careers in modern history. His death marked not only justice for his victims, but also a symbolic end to the Soviet-era's denial of social problems and criminal pathology. The legacy of Chikatilo's crimes extends far beyond the immediate horror of his actions to broader questions about how political systems can enable or hinder criminal investigation. His case demonstrated the dangers of ideological thinking that prevents honest acknowledgement of social problems and the importance of scientific approaches to criminal investigation. The Chikatilo case also highlighted the international nature of modern criminal investigation and the value of cooperation between law enforcement agencies with different approaches and expertise. The eventual success of the investigation came partly from the adoption of Western investigative techniques that had previously been rejected for political reasons. As we near the conclusion of our exploration of forgotten monsters, the cases of Suradji and Chikatilo demonstrate how cultural and political contexts can create environments where predators can operate with reduced detection and intervention. Both cases show how belief systems, whether religious or political, can be manipulated to enable criminal behavior and prevent effective responses to it. Our final descent into the abyss of forgotten evil brings us to Colombia in the 1990s, where amid the chaos of drug wars and political violence, a monster was quietly accumulating one of the most horrific victim counts in criminal history. Luis Garavito, known as the Beast of Colombia, would eventually confess to the murders of over 400 children. Yet his name remains largely unknown outside of South America, his crimes overshadowed by the spectacular violence that surrounded him. Colombia in the 1990s was a nation torn apart by multiple conflicts simultaneously. The government was fighting a brutal war against powerful drug cartels, while also dealing with left-wing guerrilla movements and right-wing paramilitary groups. In this atmosphere of normalized violence and social breakdown, where death had become commonplace and state authority was severely weakened, a predator found perfect hunting conditions. Luis Garavito Cubillos was born in 1957 in Colombia, the oldest of 7 children in a family marked by poverty, dysfunction, and violence. His father was an abusive alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children, creating a household environment characterized by fear and unpredictability. This early exposure to violence and trauma would later manifest in Garavito's own capacity for extreme cruelty, though it cannot excuse the choices he would make as an adult. Garavito's childhood was further marked by sexual abuse, reportedly at the hands of adult neighbors and acquaintances. These experiences of victimization, combined with the violence he witnessed at home, appear to have profoundly damaged his psychological development and contributed to the twisted pathology that would drive his later crimes. However, millions of children suffer similar abuse without becoming serial killers, highlighting the complex and still poorly understood factors that contribute to the development of such extreme criminal behavior. As Garavito reached adolescence and young adulthood, he began displaying the antisocial behaviors and sexual pathology that would eventually manifest in his killing spree. He had difficulty maintaining normal relationships and showed an inappropriate interest in children that should have been recognized as a warning sign. However, in the chaotic social environment of 1990s Colombia, such concerning behaviors often went unnoticed or unreported. The Colombia that provided the backdrop for Garavito's crimes was a society where children, particularly those from poor families, were extremely vulnerable. The ongoing conflicts had displaced millions of people, creating large populations of street children and orphans with minimal protection from state authorities. These children became easy targets for predators like Garavito, who recognized that their disappearances were unlikely to be thoroughly investigated or even noticed. Garavito's methodology was as calculated as it was evil. He would approach vulnerable children in markets, bus stations, and impoverished neighborhoods, presenting himself as a helpful adult who could offer them work, food, or other assistance. His ability to gain children's trust was particularly disturbing, as it demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of child psychology and the vulnerabilities of his intended victims. Once Garavito had isolated a child, he would typically take them to remote locations, where he would subject them to sexual abuse, torture, and ultimately murder. The brutality of his crimes was extreme, involving mutilation and dismemberment that suggested both sadistic pleasure in causing pain and a desire to dehumanize his victims completely. The psychological profile that emerged from his crimes revealed a predator who had lost all capacity for empathy or normal human connection. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito is believed to have murdered at least 190 boys, though his own confessions suggest the number may exceed 400. If accurate, this would make him the most prolific serial killer in documented history, surpassing even Pedro in terms of confirmed victims. The scope of his crimes is almost incomprehensible, representing not just individual tragedies but a systematic destruction of innocence on an industrial scale. The investigation of Garavito's crimes was complicated by the fragmented nature of Colombian law enforcement during this period and the ongoing violence that consumed much of the country's attention and resources. Individual murders were often attributed to the various armed groups operating in the country, while the disappearances of street children were rarely investigated thoroughly enough to reveal patterns or connections. The breakthrough in the Garavito case came not through traditional detective work, but through the persistence of one investigator, who recognized patterns that others had missed. Detective Luis Alfonso Sanabria of the Colombian National Police began connecting a series of child murders and disappearances that had occurred across multiple regions of the country. His analysis revealed similarities in methodology and victim selection that suggested a single perpetrator. Sanabria's investigation was groundbreaking in Colombian law enforcement history, representing one of the first systematic attempts to use modern investigative techniques to track a serial killer operating across multiple jurisdictions. His work involved creating detailed databases of missing children and unsolved murders, analyzing geographic patterns, and developing psychological profiles of the likely perpetrator. The investigation was also notable for its recognition of the specific vulnerabilities of street children and the ways in which their marginalized status had enabled Garavito's crimes to continue undetected. Sanabria's team made special efforts to build trust with street communities and to take seriously reports about missing children that might previously have been dismissed or ignored. The arrest of Garavito in 1999 came after investigators were able to connect him to several crime scenes through witness testimony and physical evidence. His capture revealed not just the identity of a serial killer, but also the existence of a criminal enterprise that had been operating with virtual impunity for years. The evidence against him included detailed confessions, maps showing burial sites, and physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. During his interrogation, Garavito was surprisingly cooperative, providing detailed information about his crimes and helping investigators locate the remains of many of his victims. His willingness to confess may have been motivated by a desire for recognition, a need to unburden himself of psychological pressure, or simply an understanding that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The confessions that Garavito provided were both crucial for the investigation and deeply disturbing in their content. He described his crimes with clinical detachment, providing specific details about individual victims and the methods he had used to kill them. His apparent lack of remorse and his ability to discuss horrific violence in matter-of-fact terms revealed the depth of his psychological pathology and the complete absence of normal human empathy. The trial of Luis Garavito began in 2001 and attracted significant attention throughout Colombia and Latin America. The proceedings were complicated by the sheer scope of his crimes and the challenge of organizing evidence related to hundreds of individual murders. Prosecutors had to balance the need for comprehensive justice with practical limitations on court time and resources. During the trial, Garavito's defense team attempted to argue for reduced sentences based on his cooperation with investigators and claims of mental illness. However, the systematic nature of his crimes and the evidence of extensive premeditation made these arguments largely ineffective. The court recognized that while Garavito may have suffered from mental disorders, he clearly understood the nature and consequences of his actions and had made deliberate choices to commit murder repeatedly over many years. In 2001, Garavito was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to over 1,800 years in prison, though Colombian law limits actual prison sentences to a maximum of 40 years. His conviction represented not only justice for his immediate victims, but also recognition of the systematic failures that had enabled his crimes to continue for so long. The case also had broader implications for Colombian society and law enforcement. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of street children and the need for better protection of marginalized populations. It also demonstrated the importance of systematic approaches to criminal investigation and the value of taking seriously crimes against society as most vulnerable members. Garavito remains imprisoned in Colombia, where he continues to be studied by criminologists and psychologists. attempting to understand the development and manifestation of extreme antisocial behavior. His case provides valuable insights into the psychology of serial killing, while also serving as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance against those who would prey on society's most vulnerable members. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through these dark chapters of criminal history, we must confront the uncomfortable questions that these cases raise about our society and ourselves. How do we explain the existence of individuals capable of such systematic cruelty? What does it say about our institutions and social structures that these predators were able to operate for so long without detection? The cases we've examined tonight share common threads that reveal disturbing truths about how evil can flourish in plain sight. Pedro exploited the marginalization of indigenous communities and the gaps between national justice systems. Harold Shipman used the trust placed in medical professionals to commit murder with impunity. Miyuki Ishikawa took advantage of social desperation and the breakdown of traditional support systems. Robert Hansen leveraged his respectable public image to conceal horrific private behavior. Ahmad Suradji perverted traditional spiritual beliefs to justify systematic murder. Andrei Chikatilo operated within a political system that refused to acknowledge his existence. And Luis Garavito preyed on society's most vulnerable members in an environment where their lives were considered expendable. Each of these cases reveals specific failures in the systems designed to protect society from predators, but they also reveal more fundamental questions about human nature and the conditions that allow evil to flourish. These were not spontaneous acts of violence, but systematic campaigns of murder that continued for years or decades, claiming hundreds or thousands of lives. The fact that these killers have been largely forgotten by popular culture and public memory is itself significant. While we obsess over cases like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, we ignore killers who were responsible for far more deaths and whose crimes reveal more about the systematic failures that enable such behavior. This selective memory serves no one, except potentially the predators themselves, who benefit from the reduced attention and scrutiny. The psychological profiles that emerge from these cases challenge simple explanations about the origins of evil. While many of these killers experienced childhood trauma and abuse, millions of people suffer similar experiences without becoming murderers. The transformation from victim to victimizer involves complex psychological processes that we still don't fully understand, but that clearly involve choices and decisions that these individuals made as adults. What unites these forgotten monsters is not just their capacity for violence, but their ability to exploit the blind spots and failures of the societies in which they operated. They succeeded because they understood how to take advantage of social marginalization, institutional failures, and cultural taboos that prevented effective responses to their crimes. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that the conditions that enabled these killers still exist in many parts of the world today. Political instability, social inequality, institutional corruption, and cultural stigmatization continue to create environments where predators can operate with reduced risk of detection or punishment. The marginalized populations that these killers targeted remain vulnerable in many societies. Their voices still unheard and their disappearances still uninvestigated. The question that haunts us as we conclude this exploration is not just which monsters have we forgotten, but which monsters are operating among us right now, hidden in plain sight, protected by our blind spots and institutional failures. The patterns revealed in these historical cases provide a roadmap for understanding how such predators operate and what conditions enable their behavior. Recognition of these patterns is the first step toward prevention. By understanding how killers like Shipman, Ishikawa, Hansen, Suradji, Chikatilo, and Garavito were able to operate undetected, we can work to strengthen the systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. This requires not just better law enforcement techniques, but fundamental changes in how we treat marginalized populations and respond to reports of suspicious behavior. The medical community's response to the Shipman case provides a model for how professions can reform themselves in response to systematic abuse. The changes implemented in Britain after Shipman's exposure, including improved oversight of death, certification, and drug monitoring, demonstrate that institutional reforms can make it much more difficult for similar predators to operate undetected. Similarly, the international cooperation that eventually helped track Pedro across multiple countries suggests that better coordination between law enforcement agencies can help prevent killers from exploiting jurisdictional gaps. The development of international databases and communication systems has made it harder for predators to simply move to new hunting grounds when detection becomes likely. But institutional reforms are only part of the solution. The cases we've examined tonight also highlight the importance of social attitudes and cultural values in creating environments where predators can thrive, or where they are quickly detected and stopped. Societies that marginalize certain populations, that place excessive trust in authority figures, or that are reluctant to investigate uncomfortable truths create opportunities for exploitation. The role of media and popular culture in shaping our understanding of criminal behavior is also significant. The focus on charismatic killers like Bundy and Dahmer, while ignoring more prolific but less telegenic cases, distorts public understanding of how serial killing actually occurs. This selective attention may actually make society more vulnerable by focusing on dramatic but rare patterns while ignoring more common and ultimately more dangerous behaviors. The economic dimensions of these crimes are also worth considering. Many of these killers succeeded because they preyed on populations that lacked economic and political power to demand thorough investigations or adequate protection. Targeted indigenous communities. Garavito focused on street children, and Shipman selected elderly patients with minimal family oversight. This pattern suggests that addressing economic inequality and social marginalization is not just a matter of social justice, but also of public safety. The psychological legacy of these crimes extends far beyond their immediate victims to affect entire communities and societies. The betrayal of trust represented by cases like Shipman's has lasting effects on how people relate to authority figures and institutions. The knowledge that respected community members can harbor such dark secrets undermines social cohesion and trust in ways that may never fully heal. Yet there is also something to be learned from the resilience of the communities that survive these predators. The families who never stopped searching for missing loved ones, the investigators who persisted despite institutional obstacles, and the survivors who found the courage to come forward all represent the human capacity to resist evil and seek justice, even in the darkest circumstances. The technological advances that have occurred since many of these crimes were committed offer hope for better detection and prevention in the future. DNA analysis, digital communication monitoring, and sophisticated database systems make it much more difficult for killers to operate across multiple jurisdictions or over extended periods without detection. However, these same technologies also create new opportunities for predators and new challenges for law enforcement as we look toward the future. The lessons from these forgotten monsters remain relevant and urgent. The conditions that enabled their crimes, social inequality, institutional failures, cultural taboos, and political dysfunction continue to exist in many parts of the world. The specific methods these killers used may become obsolete, but the underlying vulnerabilities they exploited remain as relevant today as they were decades ago. The responsibility for preventing future predators lies not just with law enforcement agencies, but with all members of society. Teachers, healthcare workers, social service providers, and ordinary citizens all have roles to play in recognizing warning signs and protecting vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of the crimes we've examined tonight demonstrates that they required not just individual evil, but collective failure to respond to warning signs that, in retrospect, were often quite clear. The question of how we remember and memorialize the victims of these forgotten monsters is also important. The focus on the killers themselves, while necessary for understanding and prevention, should not overshadow the lives that were lost and the families that were destroyed. Each victim had their own story, their own dreams and aspirations that were cut short by these predators. Remembering them as individuals, rather than just statistics, is both a moral imperative and a way of maintaining the human perspective necessary for preventing similar tragedies. The international dimension of many of these cases also highlights the need for global cooperation in addressing predatory behavior. Killers like cooperated across national borders could only be stopped through coordinated international efforts. As global mobility increases and communication technologies make it easier for predators to identify and access victims across great distances, the need for such cooperation becomes even more critical. The role of expertise and specialization in detecting and investigating these crimes cannot be understated. The eventual success in many of these cases came when investigators with specific training in serial crime investigation became involved. This suggests the importance of developing and maintaining specialized units within law enforcement agencies that can recognize patterns and coordinate complex investigations. Education and awareness are also crucial components of prevention. Many of these killers succeeded because their intended victims and the broader community were unaware of the warning signs of predatory behavior. Educational programs that teach people to recognize and report suspicious behavior, particularly those that focus on protecting vulnerable populations, can play important roles in prevention. The cultural and social factors that influence how societies respond to predatory behavior are complex and vary significantly across different contexts. What works as a prevention strategy in one cultural setting may be ineffective or even counterproductive in another. This suggests the need for flexible, culturally sensitive approaches that can adapt to local conditions, while maintaining focus on protecting vulnerable populations. As we conclude this exploration of history's forgotten monsters, we are left with profound questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the price of willful blindness. These killers succeeded not just because of their individual pathologies, but because of collective failures to protect those who needed protection most. Their victims were failed not just by their killers, but by societies that looked away, institutions that prioritized other concerns, and systems that valued some lives more than others. The true horror of these cases lies not just in the individual acts of violence, but in the systematic nature of the failures that enabled them. These were not unavoidable tragedies, but preventable disasters that occurred because warning signs were ignored, vulnerable populations were marginalized, and institutional priorities were misaligned. Yet there is also hope to be found in these dark stories. The eventual exposure of these killers demonstrates that truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful forces work to suppress it. The courage of survivors, the persistence of investigators, and the love of families who refuse to forget their missing loved ones all represent the human capacity to resist evil and seek justice. The changes that followed many of these cases, improved oversight systems, better international cooperation, enhanced protection for vulnerable populations, show that societies can learn from their failures and implement reforms that make future tragedies less likely. While we cannot undo the damage these forgotten monsters inflicted, we can honor their victims by working to ensure that similar predators cannot operate with impunity in the future. The monsters we have forgotten teach us as much about ourselves as they do about evil. They reveal our blind spots, our prejudices, and our failures of imagination. But they also reveal our capacity for justice, compassion, and reform. The question that remains is not whether such monsters will emerge again. They inevitably will, but whether we will be ready to recognize them and stop them before they can claim new victims. In remembering these forgotten monsters, we perform an act of resistance against the forces that would prefer their stories remain buried. We honor their victims by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless, and we protect future potential victims by understanding how such predators operate and what conditions enable their behavior. The darkness we have explored tonight is real and enduring, but it is not absolute. Against the systematic evil represented by these killers stands the equally systematic good represented by those who investigated their crimes, cared for their victims, and worked to prevent similar tragedies. In the end, that may be the most important lesson these forgotten monsters have to teach us, that evil thrives in darkness but withers when exposed to light, and that our greatest weapon against the monsters among us is the courage to see them clearly and name them for what they are. The stories we have told tonight are not entertainment, but warning and remembrance. They remind us that the most dangerous predators are often not the ones who capture headlines, but those who exploit our blind spots and prey on those whose voices are least likely to be heard. In remembering them, we commit ourselves to vigilance, to justice, and to the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The monsters may be forgotten, but their lessons must not be. The victims may be gone, but their memory demands that we do better. And the darkness may be deep, but it is not impenetrable to those with the courage to shine light into its deepest corners. That courage, more than any other force, is what stands between us and the monsters who would make us forget.